The general topic for this morning's sermon, forgiveness, was selected by our very own Michelle DeLuca, who lit our chalice for us this morning, when she won the opportunity to select a sermon topic at our annual UUCJ service auction. Now, to be fair to Michelle, I want to make it clear that I don't know that she envisioned a service in which we would spend any time looking at forgiveness as a vice. That is definitely my own spin. But if I am being asked to give a sincere talk about forgiveness, then I have to address that perspective. Understanding forgiveness solely as a virtuous act is not a particularly unusual position. In fact, I would say that it's probably the norm, especially in a religious context. And the purpose then of the church, any church, vis-a-vis the concept of forgiveness, is to simply encourage and inspire people to do more of it. But I would say maybe not so fast. I would like to suggest that forgiveness, like any meaningful act or practice with a moral polarity, is complex. To hold that forgiveness is always an unqualified moral good is reductionist and illusory. The case that forgiveness is a virtue, it's a compelling one, almost self-evident. Forgiveness is lauded as a virtue by several of the world's major religions. Numerous scientific studies have confirmed the salutary effects of forgiveness on both physical and emotional health. Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard, has suggested that human beings' increasing willingness to forgive one another may be one of the reasons there has been such a significant and steady decline in every kind of measurable violence across recorded human history. So how, or at least in what context, can forgiveness possibly be considered a vice? To make that case, I want to start by suggesting that our current natural inclination to view forgiveness so favorably is linked to our nation's Judeo-Christian roots. Although we arguably live in a post-Christian America, and Unitarian Universalism is arguably a trans-Christian religion, we nevertheless still bear vestigial thought structures that are absolutely Christian in origin, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But as UUs, I do think it behooves us to always be aware of why we think what we do. There are several Christian ideas that have been inherited and wholly adopted by UUs. In fact, it has been said that Unitarian Universalism is basically just Christianity without the Christ. That is to say, UUism, having deep historical and theological roots in Christianity, has kept the virtues, vices, and practices it inherited from Christianity while dropping the belief that Jesus Christ was necessarily divine, which, if he were, would theoretically give him, at least arguably, the authority to definitively declare what is and is not moral. So if UUs today accept one of Jesus' teachings, it probably should be because we think that that particular teaching is an objectively good idea and not because it came from a divine authority. So the question is, were all of Jesus' teachings objectively good, or at least defensible by an appeal to reason? My personal answer, which no one else has to share, is no. Now, I know that that answer is not going to win me a lot of friends in Jacksonville, maybe not even among UUs, but I'm not in really bad company. You know who agrees with me that Jesus may have had some objectively lousy ideas? Christian theologian C.S. Lewis. The following is an abridged quote from Mr. Lewis. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. A mere man who said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or the devil. Oh my gosh, C.S. Lewis. Now, I personally am not going that far. I think Jesus was a great moral teacher, but not an infallible one. And so that means that I'm going to choose to scrutinize Jesus' teachings just as I would anyone else's. And so in the spirit of Friedrich Nietzsche, who spoke presciently of the post-Christian world we now find ourselves in, I believe that it is in my best interest to reevaluate my values and to throw away the inherited values that I cannot reasonably defend. My argument this morning is that promoting forgiveness as an absolute moral good, one that we should seek to encourage at all times, is not sound moral reasoning. German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach noted that forgiveness is not a moral or secular value at all. Instead, he argued, it is a purely religious value that suspends normal ethics. And I would suggest that the religion it springs from is a form of Christianity that most of us in this room do not participate, practice, or believe in. So let's start with definitions. There are several definitions of forgiveness out there. Here's one from English theologian, the Bishop Joseph Butler. Forgiveness is the forswearing of resentment, the resolute overcoming of the anger and hatred that is naturally directed to a person who has done one an unjustified and non-excused moral injury. Not bad. Nietzsche's definition of forgiveness goes like this: slave morality. Let's unpack all of that. First, note that Nietzsche, like Butler, recognizes that when a person has been hurt, harmed, or otherwise made unwhole, there is a naturally occurring resentment or anger that will rise up in the victim. The victim will want to seek some sort of satisfaction for the harm that he or she has experienced. And satisfaction for any individual could include recompense, restitution, reconciliation, punishment, atonement, anything that might lead to the metaphysical balancing act that we sometimes call justice. Any one or combination of those elements might lead to satisfaction for a victim who has suffered harm. Sadly, in some cases, none of those elements will ever lead to complete satisfaction. But as Butler's definition suggests, forgiveness is a unilateral decision made by a victim to release his or her resentment toward the perpetrator, thus absolving the perpetrator of any obligation to provide satisfaction to assist the victim in overcoming or appeasing his or her natural resentment. Nietzsche notes the only time forgiveness would normally and rationally occur, that is, if there were not a religious system in place to mandate it, would be in relationships where there is a massive power imbalance, like between a slave and his master. If a master beats his slave, the slave will bear resentment for the unjust beating, but he has no power to seek any kind of satisfaction from the master who has abused him. So the slave is left with two choices: hold on to the resentment, which will probably over time slowly poison him from the inside out, or forgive the master so that he may release the resentment and thus at least be free from its pain and poison. If not for the power imbalance, the slave would surely and rightly seek some sort of satisfaction from the master. We recognize then that forgiveness is often a very self-centered act, and I don't mean that derogatorily. I'm simply noting that forgiveness is a decision made solely by the individual who has been harmed. It need not ever involve the offender, and the benefits will usually fall then on the person choosing to forgive. That person has now freed themselves of the poison or the boulder of resentment. And in some cases, forgiveness may be a literal act of self-preservation and self-survival, and there is nothing wrong with that. But there are times when the unilateral choice to forgive another person occurs to the detriment of the community. Now, I understand this may sound counterintuitive in a church, but there are actually several ways a proliferation of easily granted unilateral forgiveness could hurt the larger community. For example, if one forgives another person without seeking anything from the offender, that is, the victim does not seek any form of satisfaction, it could increase the likelihood that the perpetrator will reoffend and victimize another person in the community in the same way. Perhaps the perpetrator is completely unaware that he or she hurt anyone at all, and so a constructive confrontation with a victim seeking satisfaction could actually be an opportunity for atonement, restoration, and education. And even if satisfaction takes the form of punishment, that too can lead to greater safety for the community by deterring future potential harms from occurring. Forgiveness can also serve to denigrate a member of the community, namely the victim doing the forgiving. If we really believe that we are part of an interconnected web, then from an ethical perspective, I may not even have the moral authority to forgive someone who hurts me. Consider these words from Jeffrey Murphy, professor of law and philosophy at Arizona State University. A too ready tendency to forgive may properly be regarded as a vice because it may be a sign that one lacks respect for oneself. If I count morally as much as anyone else, a failure to resent moral injuries done to me is a failure to care about the moral value incarnate in my own person. To put the point in another way, if it is proper to feel indignation when I see third parties morally wronged, must it not also be proper to feel resentment when I experience moral wrong done to myself? So just as it would be improper for, say, me to forgive Tyler for an offense he committed against Thomas, so too it might be improper from the objective perspective of the interconnected web for me to forgive Tyler for an offense he commits against me, because in doing so I may not be valuing myself as an equal participant in the community. Another consideration: if a community creates a culture in which forgiveness is praised as an absolute virtue, forgiveness as a response to offense will soon become the norm rather than the exception to the norm. When forgiveness becomes expected, when it flows fast and easy, like monetary inflation, it leads to a devaluation of the currency. In other words, forgiveness comes to mean almost nothing. And thus we unwittingly incarnate what the great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. Cheap grace is what happens when a Christian thinks of the blood as Christ as a never-ending stream of atonement that allows the Christian to sin all he wants, knowing he can always seek and will always receive forgiveness from God. The great tragedy of cheap grace is that it leads logically to embracing the concept of cheap sin. Because how bad can any sin be when you have unlimited reservoirs of Christ's blood to wash it all away? The danger of cheap sin isn't just for Christians. It will happen in any community where forgiveness is too readily given, normalized, and thus becomes an expectation. And on a macro level, there are certain parties who will always benefit disproportionately from a culture of easy forgiveness. Those are the parties who hold power over the oppressed. Hey, women. Sorry about all the patriarchy. But I mean, we've come a long way. You've got the vote now. You've got reproductive rights, more or less. You're making almost as much money as men. Come on, that's pretty good. Good enough. Forgive and forget the rest. Men and women, we're all one. Let's be united. Let's not focus on the things that divide us. Hey, gay people. Sorry about all the homophobia. But we've come a long way. I mean, y'all can get married now, but you can't expect a deeply religious small business owner to serve you if he thinks it would be a sin. Just forgive him and everyone else who treats you like a second-class citizen, and wait another generation or two when everyone's more cool about it. For now, let's just focus on the commonalities, not our differences. Hey, black people. Sorry about the slavery. But gosh, that was a long time ago, and I personally, I didn't do it. I wasn't even born. I even have a black friend now. And you know, things are more or less equal-ish now. If you have a problem, remember, Jesus said, forgive. Let's forget about the past. Forgive what my ancestors did to your ancestors. Let's not talk of reparations or affirmative action. That just separates us more. We should be talking about how color is only skin deep and how we're all really the same. I'm not suggesting that any of this is intentional or by design, but a culture where forgiveness is the mark of the enlightened and spiritual will always be a culture that benefits those in positions of power and privilege, because it insulates the privileged from having to face the harm we have caused and continue to cause others, thus potentially incentivizing, if not outright exploitation, then at least reckless, thoughtless living. Moreover, in communities where forgiveness is normalized and lauded as an unquestionable moral good, a logical corollary must follow. Those who choose not to forgive, or those who cannot forgive, they then are less moral, less spiritual, less enlightened than those who do forgive. This can result in a terrible scenario where a victim is victimized a second time by his or her own community. Consider the story of a young conservative Christian girl who was molested by an older family member. Following her ordeal, she could not, or did not want to, release her resentment towards that family member. Those in her church, upon discovering what this girl had suffered, felt and communicated great pity for the girl. But that pity did not stop them from using proof texts from the Bible, from the teachings of Jesus, to tell the girl that as a Christian, she was religiously and morally obligated to forgive the perpetrator, and that if she did not, she would go to hell, because God would likewise refuse to forgive her of her sins. This is actually a common doctrine in many Christian churches, and this is certainly not an isolated story. And while it is an extreme example, similar victim punishing happens when forgiveness is a cultural norm. When forgiveness is expected of good, enlightened, moral people, it makes other victims feel morally inferior for holding on to their natural pain and anger and hurt. In the case of that little girl, her resentment toward her molester might be an ever-present massive boulder of pain and anger and hurt that she will carry with her forever. But at the same time, I have to recognize it's her boulder, not mine. And I will not presume to tell her what she should or shouldn't do with it in order to be a good person. I will not help to create an environment where she feels coerced into releasing anything. On a much less traumatic scale, I kind of came to this realization again recently while parenting my daughters, Sage and Adia. I can't even remember all the details of the incident, but one day, Adia, who is the much younger sister, she did something to Sage. Maybe she broke one of her favorite toys. Whatever it was, it really, really upset Sage. I brought the girls together. I learned what happened after my interrogation, and I commanded Adia, the younger one, to apologize. And looking back, I'm pretty sure she felt little to no moral compunction for her misdeed. Nevertheless, she said the magic words, "I'm sorry." I then told Sage, "Now accept her apology and tell her you forgive her." Sage protested, but I cut her off because good people accept apologies, and I want Sage to be a good person. It all makes perfect sense. So Sage sheepishly apologized, and then I forced them to hug. It was pretty terrible all around. When I later reflected on this whole episode, I realized that this was probably some of the absolute worst parenting I have ever done, which is saying quite a lot. Not only was it a pointless exercise for both girls, it was coercive. But I learned the lesson. So now when one of my girls harms the other, I will ask the victim if there is anything that can be done to restore her, to make it right. If so, I make sure the other one does that, but only after I have allowed the victim to explain her hurt to the offender so that the offending sister can feel the hurt she caused. Then, after restoration, or whatever approximates restoration has occurred, I ask the victimized daughter if she would like to forgive her sister. Most of the time, she says yes. There have been times when she has said, "No, I'm not ready." And I tell her, that's okay. My suspicion is that for anyone who has ever been hurt, who's been hurt? My suspicion is that the natural desire for satisfaction is actually rooted in a desire for empathy. The underlying desire is that the perpetrator share in some part of the suffering they caused. On its face, that seems just. That seems right. And from a utilitarian perspective, it leads to good social outcomes. I mentioned Steven Pinker earlier in this sermon. In his study, Pinker noted that expanding empathy is one of the biggest reasons human violence has decreased so much over the centuries. And so I would suggest that anything that encourages or allows a perpetrator, an oppressor, to understand the pain that they have caused a victim, to feel that pain in the depths of their own souls, to bear witness to the suffering they have caused in another, that is a moral good. So I don't think that quick and easy forgiveness should be a norm. On the other hand, I also don't think that revenge or bearing resentment should be a norm either. I think that there could be a third way, and if so, I believe it's the way of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a concept you've probably heard about at eye care rallies. It's a criminal justice concept, but also much more. Restorative justice is not punitive or punishing in scope, but that does not mean it advocates quick and easy forgiveness for the committing of crimes either. Restorative justice instead focuses on restitution and reconciliation between aggrieved parties and the entire community, the interconnected web. It often makes perpetrators face their victims, to hear their story, to understand their experience. If and when an apology is offered by an offender, there's a good chance that the victim will obtain the satisfaction knowing that his pain has been felt and understood. And then the victim can release his resentment without sacrificing his own moral value or the value of justice. This, I would argue, rather than cheap grace or forgiveness, rather than vengeance or poisoning yourself with hurt and resentment, this may be the more perfect expression of love. So, if you happen to think I'm completely wrong this morning, if you believe in your heart that forgiveness is absolutely virtuous in every circumstance, and if my sermon has in some way offended you, then I beg your forgiveness. Blessed be.